Right, so what I'd like to do first of all is welcome, I'm going to describe him as our keynote speaker, and we'd like to welcome Professor Jerome Cranston to our seminar series, and we're really honoured for him to join us today from Canada. I'm going to try and give an introduction, very brief one, and then I'll hand over to Professor Cranston. So Professor Cranston is a professor and the dean at the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina, which is located in Treaty 4 territory and on the traditional homelands of the Métis Nations, Saskatchewan. Professor Cranston holds a PhD, MEd, BEd, and BSc from a number of institutions in Canada, including Manitoba, Lethbridge, and Alberta. Prior to being an academic, he spent 16 years in the K-12 education system as a teacher, principal, and superintendent in a career that spanned Canada's prairie provinces. It's really important to note that the faculty at the University of Regina, which is based in the Midwest of Canada, has over many years integrated anti-oppressive, anti-racist approaches into its teacher education programs. Professor Cranston researches and teaches as part of an interdisciplinary international community of inquiry on topics that include formal and non-formal teacher preparation, the ethical dimensions of school leadership, and focus on how capacity building in the education system can transform a set of random acts into a just enterprise. We are really honoured to have you, Professor Cranston, and we thank you for the time that you're able to give us today. Thank you. I'll hand over.
Thank you, Malcolm. Sure, thanks. I'm going to, if you'll allow me to share screen, I'll pull up a PowerPoint presentation.
Yep, you can do that now.
Great. There we go. Hopefully you can see the very first slide introducing the topic. Great. So Tansei, Tanshe, bonjour. Good morning from Treaty 4 territory. It's my honor and privilege to be permitted to take about 20 minutes, if I've understood Fran and Fatima's directions correctly. They told me there's a hard 18 to 19 minutes. I'm giving myself an extra minute just in case I go on. But I'll do my very best to keep us on schedule. As Malcolm pointed out, I'm on Treaty 4 territory, home of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, and Dakota nations, also the home of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. And that's important for me, not just for an institutional purpose, but for me to recognize the land and the territory I'm on, the lives that were displaced and destroyed, the hardship that colonization has reaped on the people in the territories here, but in a global sense also. What I hope to do is, in a relatively short period of time, out of respect for the fact that I know that Fran and Fatima have covered a lot of territory around coloniality, decolonizing, not just mind structures and attitudes, a bit more of a focus on one of the areas that I work on, which is referred to as critical race theory. So I also begin by recognizing that much of my being in terms of being drawn to this work is not something that's recent. It's not something that just occurred when suddenly many people became awoke this past summer. It's to recognize that real lives have been lost. You know, it's for the Trayvon Martins, the Breonna Taylors, the Eric Gardners, the George Floyds that I always struggle when I actually have to say Mr. Floyd's name. You know, we all actually witnessed on television a murder. The Ahmaud Arbery's, from a Canadian perspective, the Sheffield Matthews, Edges, Chaudhry's, Rodney Levi's, and Aisha Hudson, a young Indigenous woman who in a police altercation would lose her life. And so for many people, you know, from the comfort of a home or an office, I think they take for granted that it's a privilege to learn and to understand racism and systemic racism without actually having to experience it on a daily basis. and that there's an extra burden for those of us who are Black, Indigenous, or of color to have to educate ourselves while at the same time living in systems and structures that are imbued, embedded, and fabricated out of a racist past. So I also locate myself. So my maternal grandma is Adivasi, a tribal woman who originated from Nepal. She was anglicized, evangelized, lost her religion to the point where my own mom didn't know her mother's actual name, didn't know the language she spoke, couldn't pinpoint on a map the city she came from. My maternal grandma would become Rosie Brown, the name that the colonizers would give her. My maternal grandfather is referred to as Anglo-Burmese, the child of a British Army soldier and a Burmese peasant. On my paternal side, I descend from a line of Scots who ended up in what was at the time East India. And my paternal grandfather was a bookkeeper on the East India Railroad Company. He would travel up and down the west side of what was then East India. 1941, he would be located at a small rail station in a town, shipping port known as Chittagong, which is now in Bangladesh, and would die when the Japanese would bomb it. And my own father at age 13 would be summoned to the rail station and identify his father by a wrist and a watch. And that is exactly the story my father told me as a child growing up. The following year, as part of the war effort to break the Axis, Winston Churchill, who all of us are familiar with, but those of you in the UK are very familiar with, would manufacture a famine in West Bengal. And my paternal grandma would be among the 3 million who would die of starvation, leaving 5 orphan children, my father one of them, who would become a ward of the state. So I locate myself as being consummately brown to actually honor my maternal grandma. So to me, being brown is my racial connotation, but because of the colonization project, I claim no ethnicity. I was born in the UK. I lived in Hull, England until I was age 4. And then we literally boarded a ship in Liverpool and headed across the Atlantic to land in Montreal. And sometimes those of us who do critical race work succumb to contemporary understandings, which get confusing. But I always draw on the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings to remind people that race and ethnicity are not synonymous. So while people will ask me if I'm South Asian or Asian of some other descent, I declare myself as brown, consummately brown. Since childhood, I've known that the face looking back at me is a brown face. And as part of my work, and I appreciate Malcolm actually cutting the intro short because they can be long, I'm a critical race scholar. You know, I've always been a person who's critical of the mainstream society that I'm part of. I've always fought back against systems and structures that I felt didn't yield any space for me, for what I hoped to be and who I wanted to become. And so as a critical race scholar, I examine, interrogate, I put under the microscope policies and practices, and in particular ones that have been designed to subordinate, subjugate Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Systems and structures that have been designed and ideologies that have been put in place to maintain and reify racial inequality. And I try to use a race-conscious approach, in particular in my field, to understand these educational injustices and the systemic racism that exists, but also to find solutions. You know, it's one thing to just point to the problems. I spent a fair amount of time trying to work with education sector partners to come up with solutions that will bring a greater sense of racial justice. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the intellect, the scholarship, the literary illumination of James Baldwin, while I know you can read this yourself, I quite often in giving presentations spend a bit of time with 2 pieces of literature that I read, trying to punctuate the value of this. So let's begin by saying that we're living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room, everyone in this call is in one way or another aware of that. We're in a revolutionary situation, no matter how unpopular that word has become in this country. The society in which we live is desperately menaced, not by Khrushchev, but from within. To any citizen of this country who figures himself responsible. Just gotta move my screen. Those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it another way, you must understand that in an attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it's operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you'll meet with the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. There is no point in pretending that this won't happen. And I begin with the James Baldwin quote, because I never want people to take lightly a commitment to critical race theory. We saw in the most recent US election that the incumbent president actually wanted to remove critical race theory from all opportunities in post-secondary and secondary education. Critical race theory is so disruptive to the domination of white privilege, of white supremacy, that politicians would actually try to ban its practice this far into the 21st century. So this notion that you're going to meet resistance if you take on the work of critical race theory is not a theoretical construct. It's very real. And although written, 37 years ago by Baldwin, it hasn't changed. So what is it? What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a theoretical and interpretive mode of understanding epistemically, ontologically, from a research perspective, that race and racism are defining characteristics of the colonization process of not only the colonizers, but those who have been colonized. Critical race theory is a diverse group of understandings, of perspectives, and approaches. It's not eclectic in the sense of anything goes. There are some foundational principles, one of which is that race comes first. So the tenets of critical race theory will include intersectionality by all means, and intersectionality as described by so many authors, Bell, Baldwin, Ladson Billing, are fundamentally important, but race comes first. And it seeks to actually change the dominance and the domination and the supremacy of those epistemologies and ontologies that privilege whiteness above all else. It seeks to interrogate the claims, the spurious claims of objectivity, meritocracy, color blindness, race neutrality, and that there is actually some sense of equality of opportunity. Critical race theory tries to turn that on its head and say, if we look at the actual evidence, the qualitative and quantitative evidence that exists, we will discover that we're living in a society that has very little interest in either equality or equity. Critical race theory acknowledges that race is a social construct. There's actually nothing at a genetic level that would suggest that my brown skin is different than your white skin. But even though we know that it's a social construction, critical race theories actually say, for something that is a social construction, there's an absolute need to recognize that it's structurally embedded, it's politicized, it's economized. So while it's a social construction, everything surrounding social life and the way that we interact with each other has been defined by the parameters of race. And so the brownness, or the blackness of your skin actually sets you on a tangent for life, or sorry, trajectory for life in terms of where mainstream society wants you to be placed. And so we see that above all is white supremacy. And then if you're, a lighter shade of brown, or a medium shade of brown, or a darker shade of brown, life will place you in certain predetermined demarcation points around what you are allowed to achieve. And critical race theory takes on notions of intersectionality, absolutely, where race, sex, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, and language all matter. But as I point out, even in this list, race comes first, and it fights against notions of essentialism. So it struggles with the fact that we can aggregate all understandings of critical race theory down to a single essence or entity. The work that I do focuses largely on systemic racism. And systemic racism in a Canadian context was something that a number of high-ranking officials, politicians, and public servants, from police to hospitals, struggled with understanding. And for a large part of Canadian society, it was a topic they didn't understand well. Most people know a racist when he or she or they open their mouth, make certain proclamations, enact certain policies. What is more difficult is to understand the impact of systemic racism, and that's where I locate a lot of my work. I never shy away from suggesting that there are racists among us and there are racists out there. But I point out they're usually quite easy to find, not only in the ways that they behave and speak, but usually with a single declaration. So, for those of you, and I realize this is a very learned crowd, here's something that I'll tell you. If you're a critical race theory, you listen to in crowds. When someone tells you, I'm the least racist person in the room, because we've all been, bathed and born and baked into a systemic racist structure. We all struggle with it. When someone makes a declaration that they're the least racist person in the room, first, they don't know everyone else in the room. So just from a practical point of view, it's problematic. But it also means they haven't really taken a look at those privileges, those unearned elements of their life that have been afforded to them based on their privilege. So with critical race theory, when you're looking at systemic racism, one of the important parts is to remind people, you individually don't have to be a racist to have actually benefited from a racist system, society, and structure. That really you have to take a look at those barriers, those obstacles that have been created that are designed to exclude, displace, marginalize particular racialized groups. It's when you take a look at the policies, the procedures, the guidelines, the norms, that you can begin to see the depth of this racist structure. The anti-racist Enid Lee talks about one of the foundational principles of systemic racism being whiteness. So this isn't a rant against white people, but this sense of whiteness, and whiteness becoming the highest level of being, plain and simple. The civilization, the languages, the cultures, and the skin color associated with Europeanness, in particular Western Europeanness. And again, with respect to all the work that Fran and Fatima have done, those colonizing nations, Great Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, the list goes on, where they imported a hierarchy and a sense in which all things would be judged against the standard of whiteness. With white supremacy comes a notion of white privilege, and a privilege that white people have that the rest of us don't. it is rare, and I say rare because I'm not an absolutist, it is rare that there will be a time where a white person is going to be asked this question. So where are you really from, Jerome? As if knowing where I'm really from is somehow a matter of someone's curiosity to explain the brownness of my skin. I cannot imagine, cannot fathom meeting a white person and asking them where they're really from. And so this notion of white privilege allows a particular permeation and permutation of a sense that you don't actually have to explain your whiteness or your white culture or your language to anyone else. It's given as the norm. And this notion of white privilege, white supremacy, and a sense of white domination become locked in. And again, the importance of this work that Fran and Fatima are doing around colonization, decolonization. Colonization was actually designed not just as an economic principle, but a segregationist set of policies and politics and ways of being that have allowed white people to get unfair advantage in all areas of social life, accumulation of wealth, employment, housing, medical services, and education. And what happens with white domination and privilege is it becomes locked in. You can actually pass it down to the next generation. And so generation after generation are able to benefit from the accumulation of the advantages and privileges. The amazing Caribbean scholar, C.W. Mills, then says, why is it that nothing's changed? If we've had these moments of awakening, why is it that nothing's changed? And Mills refers to it as white ignorance. It's a big subject. How much time do you have? It's not enough. Ignorance is usually thought of as a passive offers to knowledge, the darkness retreating before the spread of enlightenment. But imagine an ignorance that resists. Imagine an ignorance that fights back. Imagine an ignorance militant, aggressive, not to be intimidated. An ignorance that's active, dynamic, that refuses to go quietly, and not at all confined to the illiterate and uneducated, but propagated at the highest levels of the land, indeed presenting itself unblushingly as knowledge. The fortress of white supremacy, of white domination, of subjugation of all people who aren't white is very much this foundation of ignorance. And so for those of us who are invested in education, whether it's K-12 or post-secondary, it's to recognize that systemic racism and where critical race theory tries to illuminate, to bring out of the shadows, is the fact that it's all about power and privilege. And it's power and privilege that gets operationalized in so many of society's institutions, our political, our economic, our judicial, and our education systems. And the education systems being a key site that require focused attention and interrogation because of the fact that they are places of learning. They're places where we raise the consciousness, and to a degree, the unconsciousness of how we're going to live our lives. And if we aren't cautious and careful, then the tenacious, pernicious, ever-existing sense of privilege, of domination, become part of the curriculum, overt and covert, that teachers and university professors enact and reenact and actually continue to support this racist structure. And so for critical race scholars, we have to interrogate and understand how systemic racism operates and how we could become complicit in maintaining it and reproducing it in the way and the work that we do with teachers. And as my colleague Fatima knows, this is a foundational part of what we strive to do at the University of Regina. As imperfect as we are, this is a foundational commitment built into the very mission and fabric of who we are. And so I wanted to be respectful of the time to move through very topically, some orienting slides, and then to give ample opportunity for people to sit, to think, to live and have the emotions that make us human beings. So I'll close out my part of talking at you and allow you to talk to each other and to draw on the intelligence of wisdom in the room by saying merci, miigwech, and thank you, and to thank Fatima and Fran for inviting me, and to be honestly appreciative of this opportunity. So I'm going to stop sharing screen and turn it back.
Thank you so much, Professor Cranston, for, and I'm sure the chat facility is indicating this, what was illuminating, inspiring, and an honest reflection of just a hint of some of the work that you and your teams do. It was an absolute pleasure, and as I'm sure you can see that the chat facility is pinging with the same kind of responses from everyone else. So we really want to thank you for the time that you've been able to give us today.
So building on the first two seminars in this session, we explore race and racism in education and how this relates to the overall focus of the seminar series, Decolonizing Educational Relationships. So in this slide, we've adapted the metaphor developed by Vanessa Andriotti and colleagues to consider how colonialism was built on a foundation that constructed and divided the world on the basis of race. On the left-hand side is the house that colonialism built, located in Europe. This represents the colonial idea that positions Europe as the center of the world. On the right-hand side, the metaphor of the house provides a way of understanding how colonialism was constructed. The foundations of the house are built on the social constructed idea of racial hierarchies. Since the initial colonial spread in the late 1490s, these racial hierarchies were constructed on the basis of theological, biological, and more recently, cultural distinctions. However, although this might have led to different groups being located at different levels of the hierarchy at different times, what has been constant is the location of whiteness at the top of the hierarchy in the most superior position. The walls of the house are built on the foundation of the superiority of white European thought. The left-hand wall represents the assumed superiority and universality of rational thought. The wall on the right represents the idea of the nation state. It is this foundation and walls that support global capitalism. Inside the house shows how this capital is distributed across the global north and global south. At the top of the house, the north of the north represents those in the global north that are the wealthiest. Within the house, the north of the global south have wealth, and there are those within the global north who might be less wealthy, represented by south of the north. The stairs represent the idea of social mobility based on meritocracy. That is, if you work hard, you can get ahead. We demonstrated in the previous seminar how meritocracy is an illusion of neoliberalism. Finally, located outside the house is the south of the south, which represents those within the global south who have the least access to wealth. The metaphor shows how inequities that are inherent in colonialism are going to continue unless the house is dismantled, starting with its divisive, racialized foundation. Next slide, Fran. Thank you. So we've just heard Dean Cranston talk about issues around racism and the use of CRT and critical discourse analysis to investigate ways in which racism exists in society. Entrenched in society, really, just so that we're all operating with similar definitions of the concepts around racism. I'd like to quickly take you through our understandings of the different levels that are endemic in society as a whole. first of all, we need to be able to acknowledge that racism operates from and is exhibited through different expressions and in different forms. At the individual level, racist incidences occur within interactions between people, and those are very easily visible. At the institutional level, these incidents occur within institutions and systems of power, and which are much more opaque and couched in language that may camouflage racism. In other words, according to James, it maintains a system of social control that favors the dominant groups in society. The reality is that racialized minorities find themselves disadvantaged within institutional contexts, not necessarily because of openly discriminatory barriers, but because mainstream institutions were neither designed to reflect their realities or experiences, nor constructed to advance their interests or agendas. And that was a quote from Fleres 2016. At the structural level, racism is expressed within and across institutions of power and across society. These various levels of racism operate together in a lockstep model and function together as a complete system. As you can see in this little funnel sort of thing I try to create, that it's all interlocking and there's an interlocking and reciprocal relationship. Over to you, Fran.
So here we're using another image, and the image itself is designed to show how a light source that shines on an object casts a shadow. But again, we thought this was maybe a useful metaphor to think about the long legacy of coloniality. So the object blocking a light source casts its shadow, and the further the light source is from the object that blocks it, the longer the cast shadow becomes, and the further a cast shadow is from the object which casts it, the lighter and softer and less defined, less easily identifiable become its edges. So if we think of colonialism as the object, then the shadow is the legacy, i.e. coloniality, and that legacy stretches all the way from the 1490s to the present day. So that long legacy may be less distinct in its form now than it was originally, but it is still there and it's still pervasive. So the only possibility of removing the shadow is to remove the object. Fatima?
As a system of privileges and advantages, racism is about power, and expressions of racism may vary in relation to historical and social contexts and specificity, taking into account factors such as ethnicity, class, religion, race, sexuality, immigrant status, citizenship, and place of origin. We recognize that people experience oppression as a result of many aspects of their identity. But for the purposes of today's seminar, we focus on race. This is in part because in the United Kingdom, race equity often gets marginalized by equity discourses that center gender, class, sexuality, and ability. Next slide, Fran. Thank you. At the most fundamental level, racism is about power. As George Safadeh has said, everyone is differently burdened by the history of racism and all other discriminations in society. In this slide, we are showing a selection of quotes from critical race scholars in Canada and the United States of America to indicate the breadth of the field. Fran, are you clicking on your?
Yes, I'm just waiting for you to.
Okay. While CRT focuses on the experience of Black African Americans, other critical theories relate to the experiences of Indigenous and Latino or Latina communities, for example, Red Pedagogies and Lat Crit. We're going to share some quotes.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. So this is literally just a selection of the types of things that different scholars have said over time. I think it was in Africa that I came to more to see the close connection between race and wealth, and that's W.E.D. Du Bois.
Only when systemic changes, which include conversations on race and racism, are implemented will schools become more equitable environments for students of color. And that was by James Bank in 1995.
And Shireen Razak said, border control is closely linked to the internal policing of people of color, stigmatizing and monitoring such bodies in ways that clearly establish their subordinate status in the nation. And that was 1999.
And still very relevant today.
Absolutely, even more so.
Colorblindness is a set of understandings buttressed by law and the courts and reinforcing racial patterns of white dominance that defined how people comprehend, rationalize, and act on race. That was Thandika Chapman in 2013.
And then, and then another quote from George Seferdey made very recently about the banality of white consciousness, that for many white people, Black existence only comes into consciousness through Black murders, such as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, and the other people that Dean Cranston mentioned in his talk.
So while scholarship can be a form of activism, at the same time, there's a history of anti-racist activism around the globe, and some examples of which we show here today. This is to counter representations of racial discrimination that have a tendency to show minoritized ethnic groups as victims. In fact, agency has always been evident through activism that challenges and aims to change the system. But although advances are made, these are often thwarted by the power of the system itself to adapt to changes in ways that ultimately maintain the status quo, and as we show in our next slide.
So we're arguably here now because of an apparently revolutionary moment sparked by the murder of George Floyd. And this has remarkable resonances with another revolutionary moment specific to the UK, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a secondary school student in April 1993, who was stabbed to death in an unprovoked racist attack by a gang of white youths as he waited at a bus stop in Eltham, southeast London, with his friend Dwayne Brooks. And although the 5 suspects were named by multiple sources at the time and were subsequently arrested, the case was dropped in the July of the same year because Stephen's friend Dwayne's testimony was thought to be unreliable. In the years that followed, Stephen's parents, Doreen and Neville Lawrence, refused to give in and continued to take various forms of action until in 1997 they met with the new Labour Home Secretary, who launched an inquiry into the police handling of Stephen Lawrence's murder. This report, known as the Macpherson Report, was produced in 1999, 6 years after the stabbing, and found the police guilty of mistakes and institutional racism. It made 70 recommendations on changes to policing and wider public policy, including 4 recommendations specifically about the role of education in the prevention of racism. And it wasn't until 2012, 19 years after the killing, that only 2 of the 5 suspects were brought to trial, convicted, and sent to prison. And David Gilburn does a critical race theory analysis of the Stephen Lawrence case. And we're looking at it now because it has so many resonances with the present moment. And he looked at the CRT ideas of interest convergence, which means that you will support something that previously you were against or uninterested in if it benefits you to do so. And contradiction closing cases, where they create an appearance that specific extreme examples of racist practice have been sufficiently dealt with, usually by the introduction of new legislation, but in reality, they perpetuate a state of affairs in which racism continues to thrive. And David Gilburn's warning about this is that, for example, with the high profile of the Lawrence case and its symbolic importance as a potential turning point in British race politics, there are also wider lessons that it teaches us about operation of power in a racist society where exceptional breakthroughs can quickly be recolonized in ways that not only betray those involved in the initial struggle, but may actually reinforce the inequities that we are told have been addressed.
The Macpherson report ultimately led to the Race Relations Act that was passed into law in 2005. However, despite this and the 4 recommendations of the Macpherson report that specifically highlighted the role of education, a number of strategies were used that diluted the recommendations and ultimately maintained the status quo at the systemic level. These were the strategies of denial, defensiveness, and deflection, strategies associated with whiteness and white fragility that we discussed in the last seminar. For example, there was mainstream denial of the concept and therefore existence of institutional racism. There was denial of racism being endemic in educational institutions and a defense of teachers who it was thought couldn't possibly be racist, demonstrating a lack of understanding of the difference between overt and covert racism. There was deflection from and the defensiveness in the face of uncomfortable truths, as evident in the move from overt teaching about racism to soft, liberal strategies of the citizenship curriculum and the use of a colorblind approach. There was also deflection from individual and institutional racism by the use of deficit theorizing that shifted the focus to the problem of underachievement of Black, African, Caribbean students, and by asserting that this couldn't be a race issue because achievement gaps are also seen for white working class, and achievements of Asian and Chinese students are higher than those for white students. This all serves to exemplify how in this moment, which might seem revolutionary, we need to guard against the ways in which power can be used to keep the house that colonialism built intact. At this point, we give a brief overview of the political approaches to racism since people from colonies were first invited to come to Britain as British citizens to help rebuild the country after the Second World War. This started with the period of ignorance and neglect when the signs in windows, "No dogs, no coloureds, no Irish," were almost iconic in the depiction of London in the 1950s. Immigrants at the time didn't expect prejudice. They thought England was the home of justice, so we got quite a shock, Lawrence, 1974, writes. Following this was a policy of assimilation and then integration, and emphasis was still that it was up to the minoritized to change and adapt, and that there was little or no pressure upon the majority society to modify, to change its prevailing attitudes or practices. And that was from that's a quote from Eric Bolton, the former Chief Inspector of Schools, and Swan, 1985. In the late 1970s and mid-80s, multicultural education became an accepted part of public policy rhetoric, but it remained synonymous with lifestyles and celebratory approaches, criticized by anti-racists as the saris, samosas, and steel bands approach that used a very superficial understanding of cultural difference. Thatcherism was between the mid-1980s and 1997 returned to more overt racist and colorblind policies. And when the new Labour Party came to power in the late 1990s, there was hope for a new multiculturalism, such as set out by Bhikkhu Parekh in his book, Rethinking Multiculturalism. However, this was superseded by the events of 9/11 that led to the war on terror. Since 2005, we have therefore had what Gilbert refers to as aggressive majoritarianism, where politicians have argued that minoritized communities must do more to foster a sense of belonging, that asylum seekers are swamping British schools, that our tolerance is part of what makes Britain, Britain. So conform to it or don't come here. That was Tony Blair in 2006. The word tolerant just gets right to the core of me. I don't want to be tolerated by people. Although Gilbert's analysis does not make reference to this, we have also noticed that huge changes in technology have occurred at the same time as a shift from multiculturalism to aggressive majoritarianism, and along with it, the ability to be overtly racist while hiding behind a screen and anonymity. The relevance of this and Stephen Lawrence's case is that they provide a clear illustration of the long shadow of coloniality that has been cast from the 1490s to the 21st century, some of the effects of which we explore briefly in the next two slides.
So I'm thinking that because time is rushing on, that we're going to very, very briefly look at these two slides, but not look at them in any detail. And the information or the reports that led to the figures in the two slides will be made available in the Teams space. Essentially, what they do is they provide a picture of race and racism in education at higher education level, which this slide speaks to, and a report about school education and the experiences specifically of Black Caribbean pupils and their levels of exclusion in England. So if we move on to the PREVENT strategy, Fatima.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the PREVENT strategy is part of the United Kingdom's government counter-terrorism strategy that aims to reduce the threat to the United Kingdom from terrorism by stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. PREVENT focuses on all forms of terrorism and operates in a pre-criminal space. In the United Kingdom, the responsibility of primary school curriculum leaders and classroom teachers with regards to the PREVENT duty focuses on spiritual, moral, cultural, mental, and physical education. And the argument is that British terrorists are predominantly Muslim, that British Muslims are not true British citizens because they hold values that are other to British values. And this is a direct quote from Dearden, 2018. And that education can help to prevent terrorism by promoting fundamental British values as part of pupils' SMSC development. In the guidance provided by the Department of Education, the example focus on developing understanding of democracy and the rule of law rather than on identity and belonging. Part of the remit of the PREVENT duty is to bring in fundamental British values into the curriculum. In the previous lecture, we addressed how alienating and harmful this could become if fundamental British values does not take into consideration how the concept of the nation state has changed over the past century. Fundamental British values through the PREVENT strategy could be seen as having an assimilationist agenda, where a colonization of the mind, the body, the spirit takes place.
Thank you.
So we're going to give you, Fran is going to read a narrative about a student in the education system in the UK. And what we'd like you to do is to do some critical discourse analysis as you listen to her, and also right after she's finished. And we've given you some definitions here about what Malcolm has sent them through in the chat, about what individual racism is, that's at a personal level, institutional racism, and systemic racism. And so as Fran reads it, if you don't mind just putting your thoughts in the chat, that would be great. And to take a look at what specific discourses and specific formations of power and knowledge that produce and reproduce, that have shaped and continue to shape racism in all its form, and thereby perpetuating coloniality. Thank you. Fran, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you. So this is Jason's story, and all of the names have been changed. And we're sharing it with you with permission from the family to use it solely for the purpose of fostering understanding of racism in education. I was assaulted at school by a group of people. I didn't see it as a race thing when it happened, but when it got talked about a bit more, it did seem, I don't know, that it could have contributed. But I didn't see it as a race thing at the time. I didn't know if it was race or just me. And Jason said that in October 2020. Jason is the son of Catherine, a white British, and Daniel, black British of African Caribbean descent. Jason was due to start secondary school in a rural town in the southwest of England in September 2015. In July 2015, Catherine and Daniel learned that Jason had been placed in a tutor group without any of his friends from primary school. Catherine spoke with the year group leader, who told them Jason was separated from his former classmates to protect him, because the college had received numerous letters from other parents saying they didn't want their child in the same class as Jason, that he would be subject to bullying by the students, and that there was nothing she could do about potential racist bullying because she couldn't help how children are brought up. Sorry. On his first day in school, the head teacher came into Jason's class to introduce herself. She singled Jason out for comment, saying that his hair was unacceptable. In Jason's first year, his math teacher was also his tutor group teacher. She continuously belittled Jason by remarking to him that the bad behavior of the class was all his fault, that he lowered the standards of the class, and that since he was as tall as a 16-year-old, he should act like one. Jason was subject to similar comments by his teacher on an almost daily basis. Catherine and Daniel spoke to the maths teacher on multiple occasions, and on one occasion, Jason was present and Catherine asked him to leave the room because the teacher was belittling him in front of her. Catherine tried to make appointments with the head teacher to make a formal complaint against the teacher and to request that Jason be moved to a different maths group, but was constantly told by the head teacher's personal assistant that she was too busy or unavailable. Jason had to remain with this math teacher until 2018. His achievement in math suffered so much that his parents employed a personal tutor to give him lessons at home once a week for the last 2 years of his secondary schooling. During Jason's first year at the secondary school, he would often get home and tell his parents about bullying by the students. But when they reported it to the school, no action was taken. The school administration said, "We can only do things if Jason reports them to us." Jason, however, did not want to report the incidents because he didn't want to make things worse. As Jason progressed through school, he was repeatedly given detention, and some teachers told him that he would never make anything of his life or be able to get a job. One teacher, when Jason was misbehaving, told Jason to stand in that dark corner of the room because of your color, we won't be able to see you. In 2018, when Jason was in year 9, he was reprimanded by his tutor group teacher for wearing the wrong trousers to school. He was wearing trousers the correct color, but not regulation ones. The head teacher forced Jason to change into a pair of regulation trousers, but they were not big enough. He was very tall for his age. She then tried to get him to stand outside in the playground to wait for his mother to bring a regulation pair. However, he refused because the trousers were so ill-fitting that his underwear could be seen. Jason locked himself in the toilets and phoned his mother for help. On Wednesday, the 16th of October 2019, Jason was assaulted by 7 white students on the school grounds during break. He had stood up to another student who'd been intimidating a friend of his. He was then punched to the ground and attacked by the male student and his friends, who stamped on Jason's body and head, resulting in his going to A&E for an assessment of his injuries. A member of staff had been present, but the incident had not been reported to the police. Catherine and Daniel made their own report to the police, and the following day they spoke with the head teacher to ask him to report it and to ask what action the school was taking against the perpetrators of the assault. On Friday, the 18th of October, Jason went to school because he did not want to seem weak. All of the students who had assaulted him were still in school. The action the school took at that time was to isolate Jason and his friends at break times rather than to temporarily exclude the perpetrators of the assault. Catherine and Daniel decided to take action. They withdrew Jason from the school and found home tutors for him. With the help of Catherine's aunt and a colleague of hers, both academics with knowledge of the education system, they lodged a formal complaint to the school that was copied to the Chair of Governors, the local governor, and Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education. No response was ever received from the Chair of Governors or the local councillor. The head teacher undertook an internal investigation. In November 2019, Jason was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. On January the 21st, 2020, Catherine and Daniel received a reply from Ofsted that stated, "The information you have provided included specific concerns of a safeguarding nature. It is important to understand that Ofsted does not have the legal jurisdiction to investigate such matters. This responsibility falls to the local authority Children's Social Care Department. Ofsted therefore contacted the school's local authority to advise them of your concerns." Our own critical discourse analysis of Jason's story identifies systemic, institutional, and individual racism. There are examples of all of these. And the systemic one, Ofsted positioning the complaint as a safeguarding issue rather than racism, is an indication of the systemic level of diminishing or ignoring or denying racism in our school system. And then that trickles down at the institutional level, where we had 10 incidences in the text. For example, the administration acting as a gatekeeper, blocking access to the head teacher, the failure to address the racism by the pupils, insisting that they can only do something if Jason reports it rather than the parents, and so on. And then at an individual level, there are examples of racism both by the staff, the head teacher, the math teacher, as well as by the students. And in terms of the outcomes, specific outcomes, obviously educationally, Jason's academic achievements declined year on year. His parents eventually had to withdraw him from the school. Financially, Jason's parents had to pay to employ a tutor to support their son. And on a health and well-being, Jason's self-esteem suffered. He obviously had initially had a concussion, and longer term, he had post-traumatic stress disorder.
So extrapolating the relationship that is critically analyzing the discourse around the interrelationship between the individual events of racism, the school personnel's response, and the school's position and inaction to deal with the issue, even when the parents went to report these events, and the power held by the white students, and how institutional power operated in how Ofsted minimized the incidents as a safeguarding issue, all clearly exhibit a systemic racism. So, and you can see from the little things that we've put out there. This is what we found when we started to link what Jason's story had, his experiences, and how they are institutionally and systemically embedded in society. So we can see racialized students can be positioned as disruptive by teachers. They can be feel a lack of agency. School systems may act as gatekeepers, blocking parents' agency. Racialized parents may be positioned as a nuisance. Ofsted minimized racism and positioned as safety. Thank you. Fran, are you telling me to move forward?
I'm sorry. No, that was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Okay, Ofsted minimizes racism and position as a safeguarding. They position the issue as a safeguarding issue, and teachers have the potential to abuse institutional power. It's quite sad, but as I've been reading here, and I think Helen said that this is quite common in this system. Thank you, Fran. Do you want to move ahead?
Thank you.
So decolonization is a long-term process, and it's not an event. You know, it can take generations, and it starts with first decolonizing the mind. And it also means to work towards understanding our interconnectedness, that our interrelatedness, our interdependence, and the ethical responsibility we hold within those relations. It is also about resisting colonial moves to divide and rule. And for example, Kemi Badenoch, the Women and Equalities Minister, addressing MPs during a House of Commons debate on Black History Month last month, said, "Schools which teach pupils that white privilege is an uncontested fact are breaking the law." She said the government does not want children being taught about white privilege and their inherited racial guilt. And this was on the 20th of October. It is also about challenging majoritarian terminology that covers up the truth. Example, terms such as BME, BAME, or BIPOC are defined by who, about who. Is inclusion a more palatable way of saying assimilation? Are students failing or being failed by the education system? It is also about acknowledging the selective use of facts. For example, when something is described as being scientific, whose version of science is being assumed? When Churchill is being studied, is he being presented as a hero or a racist or a murderer? It is also about uncovering the narrative of lies. One narrative of lies that pervades our education system at the moment is the prevention of radicalization of young people through the PREVENT strategy and fundamental British values of democracy, the rule of law, liberty, and respect for and tolerance of others' beliefs. It is also, decolonization also starts with employing a pedagogy of love, a radical love for humanity that extends beyond humanity to all our relations, other than human and more than human. This requires a commitment to letting go of investments that have supported whiteness and coloniality, and a commitment to investing in new ways of being and doing as educators. It is essential to this work. What is essential to this work is the suspension of ego and a disposition of humility in our educational relationships. And it is these that we will explore in the next seminar in the new year.
So we're concluding with this quote from Arundhati Roy. The trouble is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence either way. You're accountable.
Thank you very much
for
listening to us and for staying 9 minutes later.